Hey everybody, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we're going to talk about chapter 5. All right, so we're going to discuss media and culture very broadly, but we're going to talk about some of the issues that come up in all of these. So let's go ahead and start up. So let's move this over here. So there's a lot of different media sources that we talk about. We're talking about digital technologies in the way of internet, television, movies, social media, news services, books, other reading material, music, gaming, advertising, and the corporations that really run some of these. But as we look at all these mass social institutions overall, we're seeing that they display, reflect, and impact the social systems that we have in place in our society. And they also express the needs, desires, anxieties, and hopes of that particular society. And so it's really just talking about how society is impacted by and impacts social media. And we'll just pop that back over there. So there's some pros and cons to media, the internet age, right? So there's a lot of access, but that access is kind of dependent on a lot of different things. So it's going to give the pros are that it's going to give access to a wide range of people. It's going to offer resources to a wide range of people. It's going to provide visibility of self to a lot of individuals that it may not have provided individual, like that may not have had that same kind of visibility in previous generations. And it's going to provide ability to network with people that are resources and or are like ourselves. There's going to create an ease of finding information. Now that also can be a con, and we'll get to that in a second. And it's a great way for collective action. And the cons are that there is an accessibility also to harms that come over social media, including things like harassment, things like trolling, things of that nature. You're also going to see accessibility to things that are like inaccurate information. So as much as it's easy to find information, it's also easy to find bad information or information that's not necessarily correct. Or is intentionally misleading. There's also harms to identity theft. It's damaging to, there's also damaging advertising, imagery in advertising and otherwise. So you're going to we talked about body image issues in the last section or last module. So some of those damaging images, right, are going to consistently be there in some of your media sources. And then limiting by resources and limited by resources and geographic region. So depending on where you are, you may not have access to the internet or access to some of these media parts. There's also ecological consequences in the way of making and or creating these and or dispensing these media outlets. There's a lot of corporate oversight and a lot of their ability to really, I guess, make decisions for what is played and what is valued. Data mining is another thing that can be a positive because it can get you an access to things that you might need or want, but it also means that a large amount of information about you is consistently taken without necessarily your consent. And then recreation and inflammation of social inequality or things of that nature. Who controls the message? So there's three main parts of people that control the message. You have the users themselves, and that can be done with using social action, using data mining just in general. What are you using and how are you using it? It's going to describe what people put money into or what they don't. And that kind of gets back to what people use. There's a generational difference. So you're going to see different things for different generations. Facebook's used a lot for those in my generation or higher, but not so much anymore in generations that are younger or that are currently probably most of the people that are taking this class. The government creates rules and regulations for the internet and for what takes place on there, and for corporate oversight. It is very limited in its corporate oversight, as we've seen with multiple battles with Facebook and censorship and all sorts of different things. Censorships from some countries, so you have China, Russia, some North Korea, a lot of different countries that create specific types of censorship and the messaging has to be very government controlled. And so that is another way that governments can do that. And those also whose voices get to determine the legislation surrounding these things. And that kind of gets to where you are in corporations, where who can lobby for the benefits, who has access. They have access to lots of your information, and they influence and regulate content in very meaningful and very problematic ways. So there's a section in there that's how to use media in your books about how to use media for social justice. And I just wanted to kind of touch base, put this in here as a very quick graphic to kind of talk about the really 10 things that they talked about in that thing. So have a clear message, making media a priority, offering news on a particular topic, watching your timing when it comes to what things are important and valued within that specific social justice framework, talking to journalists and or building contacts within those media platforms, choosing the right media, keeping it human, making it visual, and keeping it going are things that are important in using social media for social justice. So talking about television, so this gets into a lot of things, and I really kind of hammered in on some key points here. So reality shows and makeover shows, and how those depict and or perpetuate specific ideas of beauty and specific ideas of body size, shape, and is really done in a very racialized and gendered way. You have commercials and their messaging, which again, there's a lot of this. There's a very good documentary called Miss, MISS, Representation, that you can get a hold of in your Canopy app in your through the library. And I might even link it in here for this semester or for this particular thing. If you're interested in that, let me know and I can go ahead and link them in here. Let's see here, what else? So talking about specific stereotyping, so you're going to see a lot of racial stereotyping and a lot of gendered stereotyping within all sorts of different media. And we kind of talk about that a lot. There's also some video clips that I can link into you about the specific kind of stereotypes for all the different specific racial and ethnic identities and or LGBTQ plus identities. If you are interested, please let me know and I can get those posted on here. Because I know we talk about those in one of the chapters of my gender class. Okay, so there's going to be a real link here towards kind of traditional understandings of gender and traditional gender roles when it comes to television depictions. And we're going to see that kind of throughout most of your visual medias. They include a lot of racial stereotypes, a lot of queer stereotypes, just stereotypes all over the place. But I want to specifically talk about one gendered stereotype, which is this idea that we're getting a lot more female leads, but they're kind of in this badass but sexy trope, which is this idea that they're either running something or they're the head detective or they're the boss in a situation, or like comes to mind like Madam Secretary or How to Get Away with Murder or whatever. But you have this badass female character, but this archetype very thin, still predominantly white, and they're still kind of thrown out there with a lot of sexism. The men in the show generally undermine their authority using very sexist ideologies and very like icky jokes that come in there. So like really just when you look at all your female leads, what are you seeing as consistent? What are you seeing as not? Where do you see the resistance to some of those things? So like something that I'm trying to think of some that come to mind that don't kind of have that stereotype, and it's kind of hard to really think about. But then also to talk about another trope that consistently happens within cop dramas is this victim offender, like whereas like there's always female victims, it's always the murder body. Most of the time the murder bodies are female, and very aesthetically pleasing, even as a dead body. So really kind of talking about that specific trope, and talking about how news programs shape the reality of how you view the world. So there's a very big difference between someone who maybe watches the BBC newscast versus somebody who watches Fox News, right? You're going to see very different news programs depicting very, very different things. And so that's something to just look out for. In movies, we're talking about many of the same things as we talked about on the TVs, right? Like lots of stereotypes, lots of misrepresentation. But things that you can ask yourself: who's making the movies? What are the dominant themes? And who's in these movies? And as we talk about who is in these movies and these are made for, we're going to talk about those different gazes. So we're going to talk about how the male gaze really is predominant throughout these. Like they're made for men, they're specifically made for white men, they're made to sexualize women in a very particular way. There's this subversive gaze where and or oppositional gaze where you're really talking about like subverting certain kinds of ideas, certain kinds of identities, with this oppositional gaze where you're intentionally doing something that is breaking that male gaze stereotype or that norm. And then that Western gaze where you're really looking at a lot of media from a very Western lens, because that's predominantly who's going to spend money on it, which is not actually accurate. And really talking about counter cinema. So that's talking again about that feminist movie making, really talking about what do you see in the way of movies that kind of counter these ideas. And so a good idea is when you think about the Marvel movie series and movie franchise, it's predominantly white superheroes, right? But then you come along and people have to really push to make Black Panther and to make it in such a way where the majority of not only the actors that are in it, but also the directors, the writers, the people that were making the movie were also Black individuals, took a lot of criticism. And they were like, it's not going to make it at the box office. It's not going to do what it just wanted to. And it did amazing. It was an amazing movie that really thrived within that Marvel population. And I think that, again, when you have so many movie industry executives being white males in their 50s to 70s, you have a lot of like issues with really understanding what kind of audiences are there and who's looking for that visibility. And so that's something that has been a consistent part of the conversation surrounding Hollywood in general. Also, when you talk about things like romantic comedies, you're going to talk about that stereotype and some of the damaging things and ideologies that are within those, and that falling instantly in love and the lack of like past that first kiss really, or past that like instant relationship, really having idealized versions of what relationships look like, or what like how you're supposed to engage in romance, how you're supposed to engage in sex, how you're supposed to engage in all of those things. Romantic comedies has some very damaging tropes and some very concerning connections to what and how people interact and engage in relationships in the real world. You're talking about, in your book, they talked about horror films too, and how you could be literally running for your life, and you're going to be doing it in stiletto heels in your underwear for whatever reason. And I'm thinking of, I think, Scream in that one. Well, there's a couple of them that have that trope, but also like there's always a shower scene. Someone's always getting stabbed or whatever's happening in the shower or naked, like for whatever reason. And there's just a consistent issue with some of the perpetuation of sexualization of women within these kind of different frameworks. So we're going to talk about porn for a little bit. I know that's a weird topic to be kind of covering in a college course, but it's important and it's something to talk about. Technology has really changed kind of the environment and access surrounding porn. So really it's gone from like the early brothel kind of in-person interaction to kind of this pictures, kind of to magazines, kind of to video, to DVDs, to like moving towards where we are now, whereas it's very much internet-based kind of environment, and access is very easy to acquire, because really all you need is the internet and a good Google browsing website. It's a legal and protected industry, and it has a negative correlation within long-term relationships. So if you're in a long-term relationship and consistently are engaging in porn activities or engaging in watching porn, there is a negative correlation to relationships. That does not necessarily mean that porn is inherently harmful to individuals, though some argue that that is the case. Feminist porn is a genre of porn that explores alternative representations of beauty, desire, pleasure, and power, and is committed to gender equality and social justice. Again, that page number is not correlating to your book. So sorry about that. I forgot to take them out. The porn wars were this period in the 1980s during the feminist movement where there was a very big porn was a very big polarizing issue. Those who are against porn were really saying that porn was inherently sexist, oppressive, and a form of violence against women, and a commodification of women's bodies that objectifies and dehumanizes women. And in some cases, that is absolutely true, right? So we do see porn that does have all of these things as part of it. Sex positive feminism, however, argued that porn is part of sexual freedom and consent, and that it could be an educational tool if we allowed it to be, and that it can allow inclusive versions of sexual practices that just aren't necessarily part of some of the educational platforms that we currently use. Now, again, that doesn't always describe the vast majority of porn, and that's where kind of both of the two have valid points, but understanding that not allowing women to engage in pornographic activities, whether making, watching, or what have you of those things, also is controlling women's body desires and sexualities, which is something that the feminist movement actively is trying to get away from. But also understanding that in doing this, we also need to have realistic conversations about the coercion and practices of the porn industry and how to have a better grip on violence in porn, which is really really prolific within that industry, and that in and of itself, if you cannot provide consent within this, and or there's an underage aspect of this, then we need to stop having conversations about the validity of that kind of pornographic material. But it's a very complex issue when you start talking about violence in porn and whether or not it correlates to violence against women in real life. It doesn't necessarily create those power violence dynamics in relationships, but it can affirm those ideologies. So there is a high correlation to those who commit violence against women watching these things, but there's not a high correlation in watching these things in the general public and being violent against women. So if you look at it from one angle, yes, those things are reaffirming those images and understandings, but if you're looking at it from another level, but that isn't inherently mean that somebody who's going to watch these do this. However, it is still violence and exploitation of young female bodies and the production of these types of porn, and it is something that is still lacking in consent a lot of the time, and something that needs to be addressed as we start having further conversations about pornography and its links to other things in society. So as we talk about porn and kind of our youth, porn can depict sex in very unrealistic and homogenizing ways. It also depicts women's bodies in unrealistic and marginalizing ways. It can cause uncertainty about future expectations of sex for a lot of young people. It can display violence and child sex acts as normative, which is something we need to get as far away from as possible when we start having conversations. And it displays sex in ways that are racialized, gendered, aged, heteronormative, and based on ability, which may not represent those youth. However, youth are going to consistently get a hold of this material. So really what it's going to be about is having these conversations and sex education, and as parents and otherwise, sorry about that, within that and alongside these kinds of things and inside these environments, so that multiple frames of that kind of conversation about sexuality are happening in ways that are conclusive for your young youth of this generation and the next. So as we talk about music has consistently been a political tool. It's consistently been used throughout history as resistance. as cultural resistance, as what have you. It has its place to bend the norm. It's also a place for violence to people and groups. So it's also a place that radicalizes in the wrong direction. There's lots of sexualization of women in music and music videos. That is a consistent theme. And it's not just within one specific type. So no matter what kind of music you listen to, you can find violence, a sexualization of women and violence against women as parts of the conversation. It's also considered a sexual expression of women, especially women performers. You're going to see sexual expression. So it's kind of a chicken and the egg situation in these conversations is, does that sexualization of women within this create that as the only expression women performers have, or is this an expression of women that is positive thing? And it can kind of be both, right? So accessible technology equals accessible music choices. That is not always the case for everyone. So you can be very limited on what kind of music you have around you. And music is definitely has a relationship to marginalized voices, as that's consistently been a part of cultural resistance throughout the course of history. So when you look at print, again, why do people not want a wide variety of choices, and who can and has the opportunity to tell stories and which stories? So when you talk about the current battle to ban books from things and the marginalized groups that are currently being banned from this is kind of an overarching understanding of whose stories we're prioritizing and whose stories are intentionally being left out and or silenced. And there's a real problem with that. Magazines, there's a wide variety of very gendered magazines, including fashion, sexuality and relationships, self-improvement, parenting, cooking, and housekeeping. All those things are very, very gender feminine leaning, but they have very explicit messaging in them. And very much that messaging is of these very traditional gender roles and these very traditional body image issues, our body image that create lots of body image issues and homogenizing ideas of beauty. Women's magazines and the link to feminist activism. Okay, so zines and or Miss Magazine and or several other women's magazines have consistently been a place, like even in some of the cooking and housekeeping magazines from a very, very long time ago, they used to put all sorts of like birth control mechanisms and things that they thought could lead to or be a home remedy for abortion and things of that nature in the back of those magazines. It was a way for women to connect with other women. They put meeting places and times for feminist action plans, or during like the right to vote movement, the abolitionist movements. All of those kinds of things had links to magazines and written works, especially cookbooks, which is kind of cool. Again, talking about whose literature is prioritized. Feminist poetry is a good example of feminist writing resistance. Women's artwork is consistently been talked about as craft, as opposed to like really valid claims to art. And so that's something to really talk about. We also need to talk about how females are depicted in classical artwork, or just artwork in general. Lots of naked bodies, and those bodies are generally seen in very erotic ways and or sexualized in very specific ways. What forms of music and dance are considered valid? So you're going to talk about who's excluded from the arts: dance, theater, composers, musical. You're going to see a lot of racialized lines, class lines. You're going to see a lot of exclusion of specific cultures. And really just talking about like the difference between street dance and classical dance, right? It doesn't make any of them less culturally viable. Unfortunately, one is prioritized and placed a value of much higher than the other. And there's racialized, gendered, and all sorts of marginalized statuses that are part of why that is. So just to get into our small readings real quick, thinking about Shakespeare's Sister is really just talking about this kind of differential between what Shakespeare would have experienced and what a female in Shakespeare's situation would have experienced, and the vast difference that created. Again, talking about these things in the form of like going back to kind of some of our choice words, we're talking about power, autonomy, opportunity, worth, value, position, positionality, especially life chances and violence that could happen to them. And these are going to be very different as you look through both of those two different perspectives and stories. Tweeting back while shouting back is really just talking about social media's contributions to feminism, and some of the things that happen on a negative front. So really trolling, the threats, the harassment, and the competition for different support within different frameworks and or different movements. And then, but on the flip side of that, there was a lot more outreach, a lot more connections, celebrity endorsements, ease in the spread of information. It was very immediate. You could have action very quickly. And it was very accessible and a lot less intimidating for those who found in-person movements to be problematic for any number of reasons, whether it be physical, mental, or well-being. And then our last one is really talking about our Cardi B, and talking about how we need to branch our range of what feminist perspectives are and experiences are, and that there's this rigidness in academic feminism that talks about why and how feminists should look. But as we kind of branch into a more intersectional post, we could have a more both and approach. So yes, we can acknowledge some of Cardi B's not as great moments, and also acknowledge how many she can influence in such a positive way and has influenced in a positive way at the same time. So we can have this both and approach when we talk about celebrity feminism. That is, yes, they have feminism, and yes, that feminism is valid. And yes, there can be some problems at any person's feminism, and here's some of them we want to highlight in hopes that maybe we can engage in those conversations in a positive way. And then again, just talking about celebrity reach and influence as being very vast and very fast. So having some of those feminist tools or feminist movements being attached to very big, prominent celebrities can encourage a lot of people in a very short period of time to engage in those conversations, in which we really need to outside of academia and otherwise. And again, feminist work has been happening through pop culture for a long period of time. And so this is no different. And so that's kind of really this chapter. I know this one's long, but I wanted to get through it. So I hope you guys have a great couple of weeks. Please reach out if you need anything. And if I don't hear from you, have a great spring break.